Hello, BookTube. Well, the Bookish Bryants are at it again. You may remember that last year they did New Worlds November. They created a BookTube event called New Worlds November, in which they invited everybody to read science fiction specifically through the lens of shorter works. Now they put it at a short novel, 200 and something pages, all the way down to short stories. I emphasized short stories themselves because there's a million of them that you can read, and they get ignored. Shorter works tend to get ignored. And New Worlds November, I was one of the hosts. I had a great deal of fun, and it was a success. People loved it. And the Bookish Bryants weren't done. They then thought up FFS, February Fantasy Stories, where we do the exact same thing with a large roster of hosts, where we look at the genre of fantasy through shorter works. Whether a short novel or the fantasy short stories separated week by week under categories that they'd come up with. And they're doing it again for May. In May, they're doing a third event, a third genre event. Plenty more genres to go through. But they're doing a third event, and in May, we're dealing with horror. It's Horror Mayhem. And I am, once again, one of the hosts. And once again, we are suggesting that you look at the horror subgenre through shorter works. So take the novel Dracula as the upper limit of how long something can be. Of course, and this is in all cases, categories and even prompts are totally voluntary. You can, if you are participating, in Horror Mayhem, if you just read horror in the month of May, you are participating, even if you don't finish a book, and even if you decide to pick something huge. But I'm going to urge you to read short stories. And I'm going to do that myself in the month of May. And once again, we have 4 categories. So I thought I'd go over those with you. I'll leave a link to the Bookish Bryants announcement video. And the categories for week 1 is supernatural beings / creatures. So in other words, where the horror element springs from a being that should not exist. This is where you'll get your vampires, your mummies, your creatures from the bottom of the sea, that sort of thing. But as the Bookish Bryants point out in their video, this also covers cryptids. It covers cryptology, cryptozoology, the study of large or small animals or creatures that cryptozoologists are claiming live on Earth today, even though they have not been discovered systematically by science. And that opens the door for me. So that's going to be a blast. I intend to concentrate on Bigfoot, my favorite cryptid, and read as much fiction and especially nonfiction as I possibly can. All of it shorter. So, for instance, there are a couple of, believe it or not, there are a couple of Sasquatch journals that pattern themselves on on legitimate scientific journals. And they exist. I'm sure that there are tons of articles on them that I can read that would be shorter. In other words, not a long work, that would be shorter, that would fit the length category for me. I may branch out to a couple of other cryptids. I may. But a lot of the other cryptids just don't do it for me. They just don't do it for me. Like, for instance, the Dogman cryptid that is so popular, especially in the UK, doesn't work for me at all, not in the slightest. I know, in other words, that there is no such thing, because I've been over every inch. I have walked on my feet over every inch of ground that is allegedly the home to the Dogman. And I've been over that ground not only with a crowd of dogs, but as the captain of not only that crowd of dogs, but all canids on Earth. There was no canid creature anywhere nearby that I didn't know about, and certainly not one that had any kind of supernatural element or human element to it. So that's kind of ruled out. And the biggie here is the Loch Ness Monster, but that's ruled out anyway. It's a great story, it's a great idea, and I have tramped over every inch of the perimeter of Loch Ness, unlike a lot of people who believe in the Loch Ness Monster. But even if I hadn't done that and seen how comparatively barren it is, a fox would have trouble living in that area. Much less an animal that's the size of a minivan or bigger. Some of the eyewitness accounts that have sprung up have this thing as big as a city bus. That would require a ton of food a day, at least. And that isn't possible. It simply isn't possible. Not to mention, believers will say, well, how do you know that there aren't a subterranean passageway to the ocean from Loch Ness? That's entirely possible. How do you know that doesn't exist and that they go hunting in the ocean? Well, if they did, why would they go back to Loch Ness? They would be apex predators. Why would they squeeze through a rock tunnel to go back to Loch Ness? And that, besides, doesn't tally with the eyewitness. Most eyewitness accounts have this thing foraging for food on land. But even if you leave both of those things out, there are two things that just kill the Loch Ness Monster. Just kill it. Aside from a fun thing to think about, they just kill it as a legitimate cryptid. One being that we're never talking about just one individual here. We're talking about a breeding population. So hundreds of individuals, including juveniles and infants. And all of the primary candidates for a creature living in Loch Ness are all ichthyosaurs, which are air breathers. So if you just sat on the shores of Loch Ness anywhere in the lake for an hour, you would see dozens and dozens of breaches for a creature sticking its head up in order to breathe. It wouldn't happen once a century. There'd be 1,000 photographs, not just one that was revealed on the photographer's deathbed as a hoax. There aren't thousands of photos, and there aren't any other candidates for what this could be. I'm thinking probably a sturgeon of some kind, maybe, but even a sturgeon would have a real hard time finding food in a comparatively barren loch. And the other major death blow to the Loch Ness Monster is that Loch Ness has frozen solid all the way to the ground at the bottom many times in its geological history. So many times in between the extinction of all kinds of ichthyosaurs, all kinds of plesiosaurs, and today. In the interval between those two things, it is frozen solid in various ice ages. So what happened then? I actually talked to a Loch Ness believer who said, well, the Loch Ness Monsters froze with the lake and were in suspended animation. I wanted to say, this isn't Captain America. Okay, if you're frozen in ice, you suffocate. There's no air anymore. Anyway, but Bigfoot, I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's likely at all. But one of the key tenets of Bigfoot cryptozoology is that this is not just a large creature, a breeding population of large creatures living in the deep forests of, for instance, the Pacific Northwest or other parts of the world where Bigfoot sightings are common. Not only does Bigfoot cryptozoology say that such creatures live there, it also says that they know about humans, that they're smart enough, maybe quasi-human themselves, that they know enough to avoid humans, to eradicate all trace of themselves. I don't think that fans the flame of hope all that much. There would still be dead bodies. There would still be scat. There would still be the occasional juvenile getting away or slipping away from their parents' control. But I'm going to concentrate on Bigfoot for week 1 anyway. I'm going to find out what kind of short literature is out there. Then week 2 is Gothic horror. Very weak spot of mine. Gothic horror always seems to me to essentially be house-based. It's essentially a fear of a house. I've read a million examples of this stuff, and it all boils down to the fact that at night, houses can be creepy. It seems to me. I'm probably shelling it way, way short. But, like, for instance, the Bookish Bryants suggests Dracula as an example of Gothic horror that maybe you could read in week 2. And what is Dracula if it's not a fear of architecture? I could be wrong about all of this. It just seems strange to me, that's all. And, of course, that doesn't apply to me. That's never applied to me. I'm wondering if that's maybe the heart reason why Gothic horror has never really bothered me never really interested me all that much. My ability to resolve images in low light is 5 or 6 times better than yours. I can read in what you would consider to be almost complete darkness. And I'm never alone in houses. I always have dogs whose senses are even sharper than mine. In other words, we know exactly where everyone is. We can see where everyone is. We know where everyone's been. They leave a scent trail. So Gothic horror has never done it for me at all. Now, the Bookish Bryants suggested Dracula. And that sure tempts me. I reread Dracula for FFS totally without a reason. I don't know how many times I've read Dracula. I love it every time, but there's really no reason for me to do that. So I may find, for week 2, an anthology of Gothic short stories. There are plenty of them. I may find one of those and give this whole subgenre another try. See if maybe I'm missing someone who's doing it really well. Then number 3, another weak spot for me. Horror just in general is a weak spot for me. But number 3 is cosmic horror. And that is something like the Cthulhu mythos, the elder gods, or that sort of thing. Oh, God help us. And those stories have never worked on me at all. Never in the slightest. So maybe what I need to do for week 3 is bite the bullet and return to H.P. Lovecraft. That's a strong possibility. I have an ebook of the gigantic Necronomicon collection of H.P. Lovecraft. I may just do that. I may just go back to some of those stories. Some of those stories I haven't read in 45 years, and revisit them. It is a very, very healthy thing to revisit things, especially if you think you're sure about them. And what better company am I going to be in than I have for horror mayhem? We'll get to the company. But the last prompt for week 4 is folk horror, which is a terrific idea. And there's a lot of bleed through between these, obviously, in order to give you as much playing room as you need. And obviously, there's hardly an example of cryptozoology, for instance, that isn't also folklore, that isn't also folk horror, right? There was folklore about a large man-like hairy being living in the Pacific Northwest hundreds and hundreds of years before any white man ever walked there. And the same thing allegedly is true about the Loch Ness Monster and Chupacabra and a bunch of other things. There almost is always a folklore element. But I'm not going to go with cryptozoology for week 4, unless I guess there are cryptozoologists out there, cryptid fans out there who would think that is what I'm doing. But for week 4, I am going to pursue my favorite folklore-rooted horror, which is werewolves. So I'm gonna haul out. I have ebooks of a bunch of werewolf anthologies. I'm sure there are plenty more. I'm going to haul out that, but also lots and lots of nonfiction as well. There are nonfiction works on the werewolf in ancient and modern times that are right up the alley for this. So, in other words, those are your 4 prompts, and of course you can ignore them, but I think there's a lot of fun here, and part of the fun of a read-along like this, of a monthly event like this, is to line up your TBR in accordance with these things, just to shake up your reading. That's how I'm going to do it, anyway. Including Lovecraft, which is that's a big ask for me, because I know he has a legion of rabid fans on BookTube, including all of the co-hosts of this event except me. But he's never done anything for me, never at all. So maybe it is high time that I went back to Lovecraft's moped. Oh wait, no, just to Lovecraft's stories and see. But so that is horror mayhem, and I want to give you a rundown of the hosts, because we have a great number of hosts, and I think more might be in talks to join. They're people talking with the Bookish Bryants people. The first one is Mindy's Book Journey. I'll leave a link to all of these down below. Then BNB Books. A few of these channels are new to me, and I'll be exploring their back catalog. And a lot of, I'd say half the channels that are hosts for this event have dedicated large chunks of their channel or all of their channel to horror. So going to these links will really bring you up to speed on a lot of what's happening in horror, both old and new. Then the next host is Shawn D Standfast, a member in good standing of the OGBG, he of the sterling Orson Welles voice. If you've ever been to Shawn's channel, you will remember his voice. I imagine that his emphasis for horror mayhem will be old stuff. Shawn is our maestro of, for instance, very old movies, and probably the horror works that they adapt. Whatever he picks, I'm sure it'll be great. Then I'm on the list as well, Steve Donoghue, of course, but I do everything on this channel. Then Hooked on Books with Chris, which I'm relatively new to that channel. Same thing with Jim Reads Too Slow. I'll be exploring not only their mayhem videos, but also all of their back catalog. Then Michael K. Vaughan. What can I say about Michael K. Vaughan that hasn't been said already by legions of psychiatrists and parapsychiatrists? Then there's also Juan at Plagued by Visions, a channel I don't know as well as I think I should, because no matter where I look on BookTube, on this new iteration of BookTube, people who have channels that are younger than 2 years, let's say. No matter where I look, I see people just going down a list of BookTuber names, and when they get to Vaughan's channel, Played by Visions, they suddenly stop and go into an aria of praise. That yes, all these channels are great, but boy, oh boy, is he doing something great. And I don't know that. I need to go and explore that. That's intriguing. Criminolly, of course, is a co-host here, because Criminolly and his TARDIS-like infinitely expanding attic, where he has, I presume, only a limited amount of physical space, but he has the library at Alexandria up there in terms of books, all packed in boxes. The very idea of any books in boxes just gives me the shivers, but he has tons of them, and a lot of them are schlock horror. Criminolly loves his trash books. He loves them in a completely neat way. He's not trying to say they're not trash, but he's totally not ashamed of it. More booktubers could learn a lot from that kind of an attitude. And needless to say, if you were a book buyer in the 80s and early 90s, you know how many schlocky trash paperback horror novels came out then. Who knows what he has in those boxes. Then Paul Reed's Books and Books of Blood, the last two hosts for now. And again, I know that they have a large sweet spot for horror, but I don't know their channels well at all. So in addition to exploring the works of horror in May, I will be exploring the channels of my co-hosts, which is terrific. So that's it. That is Horror Mayhem. It's an event to put on your May calendar. Long way off, plenty of time to contemplate your TBRs, and in my case, plenty of time to assemble the books that I want to explore, because I'm going to read a lot of horror in May. I've never got along well with the genre. I'm not afraid of books. They don't scare me in any way. Now their content doesn't scare me in any way. So, and I have the same problem, actually the same weird mental disconnect with horror movies and TV shows. I just they don't scare me at all. Not even in the slightest. Not even jump scares. When a jump scare happens in a horror show, I'm just thinking, that must have been neat to orchestrate. I wonder what the camera angle was like there or whatever. But and yet I know that's not true for a lot of moviegoers who just, they go there in order to be terrified. I've been to movies with moviegoers like that. I went to a movie. What was it? Oh, it was some schlocky kids at a camp type thing, and there was a jump scare. I went with a bunch of muscular teenagers, of undergraduates at college, and we all got our tubs of popcorn and sat next to each other in the theater. And on the first jump scare, the guy next to me literally threw his popcorn into the air and grabbed me. I cannot imagine that as a reaction. So May will be a learning experience for me on many levels. But anyway, I wanted to make an announcement video. You'll be seeing lots of other announcement videos for Horror Mayhem. The Bookish Bryants are justifiably proud. But will they join the next genre event? The one after Horror Mayhem will be June on the Range, which I'm drafting Michael K. Vaughan into hosting, which is all about Westerns. Will the Bookish Bryants agree to be a host? I'll Voxer them until I wear them down. That's what Voxering with me is like anyway. Anyway, I wanted to put my announcement video out there with everybody else's. I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.